enforcement was getting police to integrate with the communities where they worked, walking the streets, getting to know neighbors and business owners, and staying informed about residents' concerns. But it's almost certain that Vollmer wanted to see police officers integrating themselves only within white communities. First of all, policing black neighborhoods just wasn't something that occupied much of his time. As in much of the western United States, Berkeley's black population was astoundingly low. According to U.S. Census figures, black people made up less than 1% of the city's population in 1920. Even so, Vollmer made clear in his writings that he felt African Americans were dangerous and that their mere presence contributed to crime. In one instance, he observed that southern cities both contained large black populations and had high murder rates, concluding that, quote, the Negro contributes enormously to this unbelievably high murder rate, end quote. In short, American policing may have become more professionalized, efficient, and humane under Vollmer's influence, but its racism remained potent. This disconnect bears a distinct resemblance to law enforcement's current focus on sophisticated new equipment over efforts to address fundamental systemic problems. Then, as now, reforms focusing on efficiency, organization, and technology could do little good unless deeper faults were addressed first. During World War II, because of labor shortages and an urgent need for weapons and supplies, there was a great demand for workers to fill hundreds of thousands of industrial jobs, and increasingly African Americans began to take those jobs. Of course, this was a matter of necessity, not a sign of an increasingly tolerant society. Pushback against such integration was swift and vigorous. Fearing race riots, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order in June 1941 committing to a national project of inclusion. Quote, I do hereby reaffirm the policy of the United States that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. And I do hereby declare that it is the duty of employers and of labor organizations in furtherance of said policy and of this order to provide for the full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin, end quote. The order technically stated nothing new, simply reaffirming the language and spirit spelled out in the country's founding documents. Of course, the United States had not lived up to that spirit, and the integration required by Roosevelt's executive order would in fact constitute a radical departure from the way things stood. The process of implementing the changes was arduous and bitterly contested. In Detroit, for example, high-paying jobs at automakers such as General Motors and Ford Motor Company attracted workers of all races and origins during the war, a great number of them from southern states. Mostly adhering to the executive order, companies hired vast numbers of blacks, though they were kept separated from their white counterparts. In the 2 years following Roosevelt's order, Detroit's overall population increased by about 25%, and its black population increased even faster, by about one-third over the same period. The city grew denser, and racial groups that had previously been completely segregated were forced to interact with one another more frequently, both on the streets and in the workplace. One-off fights would occur in factories. Skirmishes would play out in housing developments. Then, in June 1943, the situation reached a breaking point. That month, the Packard Motor Car Company, which had previously employed black workers but kept them segregated, promoted 3 of them from unskilled positions to skilled jobs, which until then had been held exclusively by whites, on the manufacturing floor of a facility that produced fighter planes. As many as 25,000 whites walked off the job in protest. Then, on a warm Sunday, June 20th, fights broke out between blacks and whites on Belle Isle, an island city park in the Detroit River, which is connected to Detroit's mainland by the Douglas MacArthur Bridge, which extends nearly a half mile at 2,193 feet. While much of the city remained segregated at the time, Belle Isle was a mostly integrated public property. It was therefore one of the few public places where blacks and whites would intermingle. The fights developed into a full-scale riot, taking over huge swaths of the city and lasting hours. Police responded in force and seemed to break up the melee, declaring it over by midnight. In fact, the conflict had only just begun. In the early morning hours of June 21st, fights erupted in mainland Detroit, and amid the confusion, unfounded rumors began to spread that a group of white men had tossed an African-American woman off the bridge and that black men had raped and murdered a white woman in the chaos of the day, fueling new violence. Hours passed and